Welcome to our mini lectures on the Battle of the Somme, another of our key battles that we need to keep track of. And this is another battle happening in 1916, and you'll see from the dates that the Battle of the Somme starts in June, ends in November, and so we have significant overlap with the Battle of Verdun, which is happening at the same time. The Battle of Verdun, of course, starting earlier, and as we'll discuss, the Battle of the Somme, one of its goals is actually to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. For this one, you need these set of notes on the Battle of the Somme, and so we'll be working our way through these notes, as well as looking at the maps and some photographs and some diagrams actually to help us understand what's going on at the Battle of the Somme. So let's start to begin with by having a think about the planning behind the Battle of the Somme. So here's our standard map of the Western Front, and we want to understand that planning for the Battle of the Somme actually started taking place in late 1915. And at the time we have Commander Joffre, the commander of the French army, and it was actually his plan to undertake a significant offensive in the Somme region. Now the Somme region is here. This is the Somme River and the Somme Valley around it. And the French had been in control of this sector up until around this point, with the French having a larger sector than we see at the end of the war. Now the Somme had been actually a very quiet sector up until this point, with no real battles taking place. In fact, I've seen it described as a live and let live kind of approach that was operating in this sector, which was being held by the French before 1916. All of the action had, of course, in 1915 been taking place further north in this area, or further east in the Champagne area, and of course we have Verdun at the beginning of 1916. So the Somme area had been quite a quiet sector up until this point. Being a very rural area, supplies had to be brought in to support the development of a new offensive, and we do see some rail links actually having to be built and some extra roads just to be able to bring supplies into the area in order to support a massive offensive. This gives you a shot of typical French countryside in the area of the Somme. This is a modern day shot, of course, and you can see these very open fields, rolling hills, and this is the landscape in which this offensive is going to be taking place. Now, as 1916 progressed, and this was intended, the Somme offensive was intended to be a French-led offensive, but with support from the British. And plans for that, of course, are kind of upset by the Battle of Verdun, which is taking place over here. Remembering the Battle of Verdun was a German offensive and therefore took the French by surprise. The Battle of Verdun, however, had, of course, been a huge drain on the French army. And so the idea that the French could hold Verdun and simultaneously undertake an offensive in the Somme area becomes very, very unlikely. They really can't hold it. And therefore, the primary role of undertaking the Somme offensive turned to the British, who were going to just play a supporting role, but now are basically in charge of leading the Somme. There is, however, a lot of pressure to continue with the Somme offensive because of its potential to drag German troops from the Battle of Verdun up to the Somme area and therefore relieving pressure from Verdun. So there is a lot of pressure to go ahead with the Somme offensive, but it's now going to be a British action, more so than a French-led action. So the guy we've got in charge now, this shows us a battle, the Somme area. And so this is the line and there's the river there. So this is the front line. The dark line is the front line at the beginning of the Somme offensive. And the light line here that I'm tracing over, that's the river Somme. Now the French had control from this line further south. So the French controlled this sector of the line, while this particular area in the middle is a British offensive, and we've got the 4th British Army there, led by Rawlinson, in this area of the Somme. Then we've got another British Army to the north that don't take, they only have some diversionary manoeuvres. It is up to the 4th Army with the 5th Army in reserve that are going to undertake the main part of the offensive here. But as you can see, the French are also involved, but on a smaller part of the line. And of course, on the other side, we have the German, it's actually the 2nd Army, is defending this particular sector of the line. This picture, which you have, but of course it looks much nicer in colour, is quite good because it shows us where the lines are for the where the Germans are. So this is the front line. The dark green line is where the Germans were initially. So that's their first, that front line. But then we have the 2nd German line is further back. And then we have the 3rd German line even further back again. And this is about from the front line back to this position near the town of Fleur, for example. We've got about 8 kilometres. So about 8 kilometres between the 1st and the 3rd German line. And you can see on this map as well, and the previous map, that we've got some key towns in the area. Albert here is a very large town behind the British lines at the time. We've got the town of Peronne on this side, which was behind the German lines at the time, and Bapaume up here also behind the German lines. And then there are some names that different battles take place at in the Somme area of villages. So the village of Pozières, for example, and the slightly larger village of Thiepval. Some other famous names that we'll be talking about is Fleur here, and Fricourt right at the beginning of the battle. So these are all small villages, and we've also got woods dotted around the countryside, and all of those these places become names that feature if you look at a very close look at how the Battle of the Somme progresses. Now we have Douglas Haig. General Douglas Haig is in charge of the British Army by this stage. Remember, he took over in late 1915. Now, Haig is very famous for his commitment to a breakthrough plan. So, his plan requires very, very heavy artillery bombardment, and he's talking about over several days, possibly a week. And his intent with the heavy artillery bombardment, using tactics that had been developed through 1915, he wants to inflict huge damage on the defenders. So damage on the German army itself, as well as their trenches. After the heavy artillery bombardment would be followed by an infantry push through the first line. So, for example, an infantry push through the first line, create a gap, which would then allow a cavalry push to come through the gap on the horses and gallop across to start to take the 2nd line German trenches, while the Germans are disorganised and on the run is the idea. The aim is to achieve a breakthrough on the first day of the battle. That's what a breakthrough plan entails. Now, I just want to tell you that there were others at the time that were coming up with other suggestions. So this guy here is Henry Rawlinson, General Henry Rawlinson, who was a commander underneath Haig at the time. I know they look really similar, but they are actually different people. Now, Rawlinson had suggested, based on his experiences in the battles of 1915, that instead of aiming for a complete breakthrough on day one, he makes a suggestion. How about Our first day goal is just to secure the front line, which would push the Germans back. But instead of breaking through, we bite, take control of the front line, and then we hold it. When that is firmly secure, then we move forward to attempt to take the second line. This is what we call a bite and hold tactic. Now, Haig rejected the tactic. Haig considers that the bite and hold tactic was too cautious. And to give him credit, what he feels is that the heavy artillery bombardment would so demoralize and destroy the German army that, followed by a quick offensive, the German army would be so disorganized that to not use a breakthrough tactic on day one would be to give up an opportunity that wouldn't come again. If they gave the Germans time to regather on the second line and resettle, Haig felt that there would be no opportunity for further gain. So therefore, Haig rejects the bite and hold tactic, says it's too cautious, and goes for a direct breakthrough tactic. We will see Rawlinson's bite and hold tactic come back, and bite and hold tactics are used in 1917. Now, the other thing to take note of is that the original British Army, which you might recall was quite small but well trained, well, they'd kind of been decimated by the battles of 1914 and 1915. And so what we have in place at the beginning in going into the Somme in 1916 is what is referred to as Kitchener's Army. Now, Lord Kitchener was the Secretary of War. This is actually Lord Kitchener here, featured in this very, very famous poster, recruitment poster. And it had been Kitchener's job to basically recruit volunteers into the army. And this picture here is giving us, you can actually see it's written on here, part of Kitchener's new army. So these were all volunteers who had joined up in 1914 and 1915. And here they are receiving training. I have no idea what they're actually doing, but this is training being undertaken by these volunteers. So referred to as Kitchener's Army, there were a lot of volunteers in 1914 and also the beginning of 1915, but by the end of 1915 it was getting more and more difficult to get volunteers joining up to the British Army. Those that were keen had already volunteered by that stage. As well, some of the ideas of what warfare was going to be like had started to filter back home by the middle of 1915 with some of those key battles that we looked at and those who were dying and those suffering injuries. So by the end of 1915, the British government is really running out of ideas, and therefore we see conscription introduced at the beginning of 1916 in order to continue the flow of recruits to replace those who were being mown down, basically, on the front lines of the Western Front. This was a war of attrition, and when you have that, you need constant replacements to come in. So by 1916, we don't so much have the conscriptees coming into the army at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, but we do have mostly inexperienced, and this is the kind of training they're undertaking, so not well-trained young men coming into the army, keen and eager to fight at the Battle of the Somme, but not necessarily well-trained. And this includes the officers that are going to lead them into battle, the young officers on the front lines, like the lieutenants and some of the captains, not necessarily well experienced, but very keen. So what we'll do in the next video is we'll come back and just see how Kitchener's Army goes as we open up the Somme offensive.